You think you know BBQ. You fire up the grill on the 4th of July, you crack open your favorite sauce, you bite into a rack of ribs, and you feel like you are part of some all American tradition that belongs to everyone equally. What nobody tells you at that backyard cookout is that almost everything on that table, the ribs, the pulled pork, the burnt ends, the vinegar sauce, the hot links, the dry rub, the smoked chicken, the hush puppies beside it, the collard greens on that paper plate traces back to one group of people who invented American barbecue from the ground up and have spent 2 centuries watching the world take credit for their genius. Black pitmasters built the entire American BBQ tradition, not assisted with it, not contributed a little to it, built it. From the pit in the ground to the smoke rising through hardwood to the specific cuts of meat that the rest of America now calls iconic, black hands did this work long before it became a billion-dollar industry, long before it appeared on magazine covers, long before anyone started winning trophies for it. Today we are talking about 10 specific foods that black pitmasters invented at the BBQ. Foods that are now beloved by millions of Americans who have never heard the names of the people who created them. Stay until the end, because the last one on this list is something you probably eat every summer without ever knowing the extraordinary story behind it. Number 10, whole hog barbecue. Before there were brisket competitions in Texas or pulled pork sandwiches in Tennessee fast food chains, there was the whole hog. And the whole hog belongs to black pitmasters the way jazz belongs to New Orleans. The technique of cooking an entire pig, low and slow, over a pit of hardwood coals for 12 to 24 hours straight is one of the oldest and most technically demanding forms of cooking in the American South. It requires reading the fire the way a musician reads sheet music. Too much heat and the exterior chars before the interior is cooked through. Too little heat and the collagen never breaks down. The pig has to be basted constantly, repositioned, managed through the night without a thermometer, without a timer, and without a single margin for error. Because when you are feeding hundreds of people at a plantation celebration or a community gathering and you have one animal, there is no second chance. The men and women who mastered this technique were the enslaved black cooks who were assigned to oversee these community events. Their names were rarely recorded. Their skills were described in the newspapers of the day in terms that credited the white plantation owners, who hosted the feasts rather than the black pitmasters who produced them. Culinary historian Adrian Miller, author of Black Smoke, documented the first printed reference to the word pitmaster appearing in 1939 and noted that the role it described, an older, experienced cook who oversaw the younger laborers in preparing the barbecue, was specifically a role held by enslaved black men and women for the 2 centuries before that word was ever written down. Today, the clearest living connection to this tradition is Rodney Scott, whose whole hog operation in Charleston, South Carolina, earned him a James Beard Award in 2018, making him the first pitmaster from South Carolina to receive that honor. When you taste whole hog barbecue, you are tasting a technology developed by people who had no choice but to be brilliant, and who were brilliant anyway. Number 9, vinegar-based barbecue sauce. There is a reason that Eastern North Carolina vinegar sauce has not changed in over 200 years. When something is perfected by the people who perfected it, there is nothing to change. The original BBQ sauce in America was not thick, sweet, or tomato-based. It was vinegar, hot pepper, salt, sometimes a little butter, sometimes sage, coriander, and basil added in proportions that each pitmaster kept in their own memory, because writing down a recipe was not something enslaved cooks were permitted to do. The WPA Slave Narratives, a collection of first-person accounts of slavery gathered in the 1930s, contain a description of barbecue sauce preparation so vivid and technically precise that food historians still cite it today. A formerly enslaved man describes staying up all night, wrapping cloth around a long pronged stick, soaking it in the sauce mixture, and swabbing the meat continuously while it cooked over a pit. He described how the drippings falling into the fire created seasoned smoke that penetrated the meat from both outside and inside simultaneously. That is not a simple recipe. That is a sophisticated understanding of how fat, acid, heat, and smoke interact, built from years of practice and passed down through oral tradition across generations. The vinegar sauce that defines Eastern North Carolina barbecue today is the direct descendant of those nighttime preparations, unchanged because it was already complete when it was invented. The people who invented it just were not given credit on the label. Number 8, the dry rub. When you reach for a jar of spice rub, when you press paprika and garlic and cayenne and brown sugar into the surface of a rack of ribs the night before you smoke them, you are practicing a technique that African Americans developed from a tradition that goes back to West Africa. In West Africa, rubbing meat with dry spices before cooking over fire was common long before European or American cookbooks described anything like it. The Hausa people, among others, had established practices of seasoning meat with black pepper, cloves, and other spices before cooking. When enslaved Africans arrived in the American South, they brought those flavor instincts with them and adapted them to the ingredients available, creating the combination of sweet, salt, heat, and smokiness that defines a proper Southern dry rub. Memphis-style barbecue, which relies almost entirely on the dry rub rather than sauce applied during cooking, is the clearest expression of this tradition. The dry ribs of Memphis, coated in a careful blend of paprika, garlic, cayenne, brown sugar, and black pepper, then smoked low and slow over hickory, represent a technique passed down through black communities in Tennessee across generations. When food media discovered dry rub in the 20th century and began celebrating it as a new trend in American cooking, the black pitmasters who had been doing it for centuries received almost no acknowledgement. The technique was celebrated. The people were not. Number 7, burnt ends. If there is one BBQ food that has been stolen most visibly from its black creators, it is burnt ends. Today, burnt ends are on the menu of upscale restaurants across the country. Texas barbecue joints promote them as a premium product. Food bloggers photograph them like jewelry, and almost none of them mention Arthur Bryant. Arthur Bryant was a black pitmaster from Kansas City, whose restaurant, founded on the foundations laid by his mentor Henry Perry, became what Craig Claiborne of the New York Times called the single best restaurant in the world in 1972. Burnt ends at Bryant's were not originally a menu item. They were the scraps. When Bryant sliced brisket for customers, the dark, chewy, heavily smoked end pieces did not slice cleanly, so he piled them in a basket near the front of the restaurant and let people eat them while they waited for their orders. People started coming specifically for the scraps. A dish that began as the least valuable part of the brisket, given away because it could not be sold, became the most famous product of one of the most celebrated barbecue restaurants in America. That is a story that runs through the entire history of black BBQ. Taking what others discarded and transforming it through technique, patience, and genius into something the world eventually had to acknowledge was extraordinary. Bryant never patented burnt ends. He did not need to. The dish was his, and the history is clear for anyone willing to read it. Number 6, hot links. You know them at the barbecue as hot links, those deep red, heavily spiced sausages that sizzle on the grill with a snap when you bite into them, and a heat that builds long after you swallow. Hot links are one of the most distinctly African American contributions to the American BBQ table, and their story begins in the same place that so many BBQ stories begin, with the parts of the animal that nobody else wanted. When enslaved black cooks were given access to the hog, they were given access to the whole hog, but not the whole hog equally. The premium cuts went to the plantation house. The intestines, the snout, the feet. The less desirable trimmings went to the quarters. Black cooks took those trimmings, seasoned them aggressively with cayenne and black pepper and garlic, packed them into casings, and created a product that was so flavorful and so satisfying that it eventually spread beyond the black community and became a regional staple across the South and the Midwest. When the Great Migration carried millions of black Americans from the South to Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, and Kansas City between 1910 and 1970, they brought hot links with them. Rib tips and hot links became the defining combination of Chicago South Side barbecue, served together from backyard smokers and small storefronts in neighborhoods that the food media ignored for decades. When that food media finally arrived decades later, they described Chicago BBQ as if it had materialized out of nowhere, neglecting to mention the black pitmasters who had been perfecting it in the same neighborhoods for 3 generations. Number 5, smoked chicken. Pork gets most of the attention in the barbecue conversation, but smoked chicken has its own long and specific history rooted in black pit cooking that goes back before the Civil War. Black cooks understood something about chicken and smoke that was not widely acknowledged until relatively recently in culinary terms. That chicken fat, when rendered slowly over indirect heat, bastes the meat from the inside while smoke penetrates from the outside. And the result, when done correctly, has a depth of flavor and a textural complexity that no other cooking method can reproduce. This understanding was not arrived at through culinary school or cookbooks. It was arrived at through practice, through cooking thousands of birds over years of community celebrations, church gatherings, and the large outdoor events that black communities organized as expressions of cultural identity and collective joy. Barbecue historian Adrian Miller has written extensively about how African American barbecue has always featured chicken as a centerpiece alongside pork, with the meat served, sauced, and cooked directly over coals to achieve that charcoal flavor that distinguishes the black BBQ tradition from the Central Texas style of smoking over indirect heat. The smoked chicken you buy today at any restaurant that takes barbecue seriously traces its technique to black pitmasters, who spent generations learning exactly how fire and smoke and fat interact in a bird. Number 4, pulled pork. Pulled pork is so deeply embedded in American food culture that it appears at stadium concession stands, in supermarket freezer sections, and on the menus of restaurants from Maine to Hawaii that have never been within 500 miles of the Carolinas. And all of it traces back to black pitmasters in the American South who developed the technique of cooking a pork shoulder so slowly at such low heat for so long that the collagen in the meat completely breaks down and the entire structure dissolves into tender, shreddable fibers that can be pulled apart by hand. This is not an accident of cooking. This is a specific technical achievement that requires knowing exactly how long to hold a specific temperature, exactly when to pull the meat from the heat, and exactly how to dress it with sauce and integrate the bark, the flavorful dark crust formed by the smoke and the fat and the seasonings, into the pulled meat itself so that every bite has the right balance of tenderness and texture. The technique was developed by black pitmasters who were cooking for crowds at community gatherings and needed a method that could feed hundreds of people efficiently while maintaining the kind of flavor that made those gatherings worth coming to. The word barbecue itself, when used to describe a social gathering centered around smoked pork, was historically inseparable from black community life in the South. Pulled pork was the centerpiece of that gathering, and the people who made it perfect deserved far more recognition than the industry ever gave them. Number 3, the mop sauce technique. This is one that most people outside of serious BBQ circles do not know has a name, but everyone who has tasted great barbecue has tasted its results. A mop sauce is a thin liquid applied repeatedly to meat during the smoking process, usually with a cotton mop head attached to a long handle to keep the surface moist, Add continuous layers of flavor and moderate the temperature of the exterior while the interior slowly comes up to temperature. The technique is described in precise detail in multiple WPA slave narratives from formerly enslaved black pitmasters, and the description in those accounts is functionally identical to what serious pitmasters still do today. One account describes making a sauce of vinegar, black and red pepper, salt, butter, sage, coriander, basil, onion, and garlic, then swabbing the meat continuously through the night, describing how the drippings fell into the fire and transformed into seasoned smoke. That is not improvisation. That is a complete system of flavor development that integrates the sauce, the fire, and the smoke into a unified cooking process. The mop sauce technique is one of the reasons that low and slow pit barbecue produces flavors that cannot be replicated by any other cooking method, and it was invented by black pitmasters who had no books telling them how to do it. They figured it out by doing it, and they taught it to each other across generations, and the knowledge is still alive today in the hands of pitmasters like Rodney Scott, who still mops his whole hogs through the night the way his family has done for generations. Number 2, rib tips and scrap cooking. You cannot understand black BBQ without understanding what food historian and culinary anthropologist Michael Twitty has described as the ingenious resourcefulness at the heart of African American cooking. The entire tradition of taking the parts that the dominant culture discarded and transforming them into something transcendent runs from West African cooking practices through the plantation system and directly into the storefronts and backyards, where black pitmasters in Chicago and St. Louis and Kansas City built a cuisine out of rib tips, which are the cartilaginous ends cut from spare ribs to make them rectangular for easier handling at meatpacking plants, and snoots, which are smoked pig snouts and neck bones and all the other pieces that were considered valueless by the industry. Gary Kennebrew, the pitmaster at Uncle John's BBQ in Chicago, described this history with absolute clarity. The old-timers were savvy enough to take what other folks looked at as scrap and turn it into revenue. That, he said, is part of the history of being black. The rib tip is now considered a delicacy in Chicago, sought out by food writers and celebrated on menus. And there is a direct, unbroken line from the meatpacking scraps given to black workers in the early 20th century to the beloved dish being served today. The people who invented this food invented it under circumstances that demanded the maximum from their creativity and skill, and they delivered something extraordinary. Number 1, the pit itself. Everything on this list flows from this one thing, and it is the foundation that makes every other entry possible. The pit, not the grill, not the Weber kettle that Ford Motor Company helped popularize in the suburbs after the Second World War. The actual pit, the trench dug into the earth, lined with coals from hardwood burned down to the right temperature, where animals were hung or laid across green wood racks and cooked over direct and indirect heat for hours and sometimes days. This technology, this specific method of using the earth itself as a cooking vessel, of managing fire at a distance, of surrounding meat with heat and smoke simultaneously while controlling the temperature through the depth of the pit and the arrangement of the coals, was brought to the American South by enslaved Africans who carried knowledge of fire cooking from West Africa and merged it with techniques they encountered in the Americas. Dr. Howard Conyers, a NASA rocket scientist and pitmaster who has studied the history of African American BBQ extensively, has documented how the earth pit method remained central to black communities long after the backyard grill replaced it elsewhere, surviving as a living tradition because black families continued practicing it at Juneteenth celebrations and family reunions and church cookouts across the South. When his father drew a diagram of a pit layout from memory, Conyers recognized that the design was identical to descriptions of pit cooking from accounts of enslaved people more than a century earlier. The knowledge had been passed down without interruption, without a book, without a program, just from pitmaster to apprentice across generations. That is the most important food technology in American BBQ history. Black pitmasters built it, protected it, and gave it to the world. The least we can do is say their names. The least we can do is understand that when we stand in front of a grill on a summer Saturday and smell that smoke and feel that heat, we are participating in a tradition that belongs first and most completely to the people who invented it under the hardest conditions imaginable and produced something beautiful anyway. Here is what 10 foods Black Pitmasters invented at the BBQ tells you when you see it all together. Whole hog, vinegar sauce, dry rub, burnt ends, hot links, smoked chicken, pulled pork, mop sauce, rib tip cookery, and the pit itself. That is not a contribution to American barbecue. That is American barbecue. Without Black Pitmasters, there is no tradition to celebrate, no regional pride to defend, no billion-dollar competition circuit, no magazine covers, no television shows, no James Beard Awards given to the people who were finally, after decades of being ignored, being recognized for what they had always been. The best in the world at what they do. The names you should know include Henry Perry, who founded Kansas City Barbecue in 1908 after traveling up from Tennessee. Arthur Bryant, who turned burnt ends from scraps into legend. Marie Jean, the enslaved woman who managed the barbecue for an entire Arkansas community in 1840 and was celebrated in the local newspaper and eventually bought her own freedom and ran her own restaurant. Rodney Scott, who earned the James Beard Award in 2018. The Jones Sisters of Kansas City, who said that understanding barbecue is something you could do to know how to survive. Those words carry everything you need to understand about what 10 foods Black Pitmasters invented at the BBQ really means. This food was not made for fun. It was made as an act of survival, of cultural preservation, of identity maintained under conditions designed to destroy it. And it is still here. Still being smoked over hardwood, still being mopped through the night, still being eaten at Juneteenth celebrations 200 years after the tradition began. Juneteenth itself has always been celebrated with barbecue in Black communities, because barbecue was always more than food. It was freedom food. The flavor of community assembled by choice rather than by force. Every rack of ribs at a Juneteenth cookout is a declaration that the people who invented this tradition are still here. The Barbecue Hall of Fame has 36 inductees. Only 5 of them are Black. That number is a failure of history and a failure of recognition, but it doesn't change the facts. The facts are in the smoke, in the vinegar, in the way a properly cooked whole hog falls apart when you touch it, in the bark on a rack of ribs that took someone 16 hours to produce. Black Pitmasters built every piece of that. If this opened your eyes, drop a comment with the BBQ dish you will never look at the same way again. Share this with someone who loves barbecue and deserves to know where it came from. Subscribe so you never miss another piece of history that was hiding in plain sight on your dinner plate. These stories matter. These names matter. This food is a monument, and now you know who built it.